The moment he stood up, shook his head, and walked away, the entire restaurant seemed to fall silent around her. Not because anyone knew what had happened, but because heartbreak has a way of making the world look frozen. She sat there alone at a small table near the window, staring down at the untouched glass of water in front of her. Her shoulders trembled slightly. She tried to hold back the tears, but one escaped and rolled down her cheek. Across the room, I watched everything, and something inside me refused to let that moment become the end of her story. Before we begin, if you believe kindness still matters, if you believe everyone deserves a second chance and that one small act can change a life, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. My name is Nathan Brooks, and at the time I was 34 years old, living in Portland, Oregon. Life looked fine from the outside. I had a stable job as an architect, a decent apartment downtown, and enough money to pay my bills comfortably, but appearances can be deceiving. 2 years earlier, my fiancé had left me 3 months before our wedding. One day we were discussing flower arrangements and honeymoon destinations. The next day she was gone. The experience shattered my confidence. After that, I stopped believing in love. I buried myself in work. Weekdays became weekends. Weekends became months. Months became years. I convinced myself that loneliness was easier than disappointment. Then, one rainy Thursday evening changed everything. I had stopped at a restaurant near the river after a long day at work. The place was warm and cozy, filled with soft music and the smell of fresh bread. That's when I noticed her. Her name, I would later learn, was Grace Mitchell. She sat alone at a table dressed elegantly but simply. She looked nervous, checking her phone every few minutes. Eventually, a man arrived. He barely smiled. They spoke for about 15 minutes. Then something changed. His expression hardened. He glanced around the room, looked back at her, and said something that made her face fall instantly. A few seconds later, he stood up and left. Just like that. No goodbye. No apology. Nothing. Grace remained frozen in her seat. I could see her fighting tears. Most people looked away. Some pretended not to notice. But I couldn't. Maybe because I knew exactly what rejection felt like. Maybe because I remembered sitting alone after my own heart had been broken. Or maybe because sometimes God places us in a specific moment for a reason. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stood up and walked across the room. I stopped beside her table. She looked up with red eyes, and I asked the simplest question I could think of. "Can I sit here?" For a moment, she looked surprised. Then she nodded. The next 2 hours changed both our lives. At first, the conversation was awkward. She apologized for crying. I apologized for interrupting. We laughed nervously. Slowly, the tension faded. She explained that she had met the man through mutual friends. This was their blind date. Everything had seemed normal until he discovered she worked as a middle school teacher instead of a corporate executive. Apparently, he had expected someone more successful, someone wealthier, someone he considered more impressive. The ridiculousness of it almost made me angry. But Grace wasn't angry. She was hurt. Not because she wanted that man, but because she was tired of being overlooked, tired of feeling like she wasn't enough. As she spoke, I realized something remarkable. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't selfish. She wasn't demanding. She was one of the kindest people I had ever met. She spent weekends helping at community food drives. She tutored struggling students after school without charging families. She remembered the names of homeless people she passed each morning. She cared deeply about others. Yet somehow life kept convincing her she wasn't valuable. When the restaurant finally closed, we walked outside together. Rain was falling gently. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely connected to another human being. Before leaving, we exchanged phone numbers. I remember driving home with a strange feeling in my chest. Hope. A feeling I thought had disappeared forever. Over the following weeks, we became friends, then close friends, then something more. We visited bookstores, coffee shops, hiking trails, and farmers markets. Nothing extravagant, nothing dramatic. Just two people slowly learning to trust again. Grace taught me that vulnerability wasn't weakness. I taught her that her worth wasn't determined by someone's opinion. But healing isn't always a straight line. Both of us carried scars. There were moments when fear resurfaced, moments when old wounds reopened. Sometimes I worried she would eventually leave. Sometimes she worried she wasn't good enough for me. The ghosts of our pasts followed us everywhere. One evening, nearly a year after we met, those fears nearly destroyed everything. We were sitting on a bench overlooking the Columbia River. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. What should have been a beautiful evening turned into an argument. A small misunderstanding escalated quickly. Words were spoken carelessly. Pain resurfaced. For the first time since meeting, Grace stood up and walked away in tears. I watched her disappear down the path. Suddenly, I was back in the worst moment of my life. Abandoned, alone, terrified. Part of me wanted to let her go. Part of me wanted to protect myself. But then I remembered that restaurant. I remembered seeing her cry alone. I remembered choosing kindness instead of distance. So I got up and followed her. I found her standing near the riverbank. Neither of us spoke immediately. The wind blew gently across the water. Finally, I told her the truth. I admitted how afraid I was, how much losing her would hurt, how much I loved her, not despite her imperfections, because of them, because they made her real. Grace cried again, but this time the tears were different. They weren't tears of rejection, they were tears of relief. For the first time, both of us stopped pretending to be fearless, and that honesty changed everything. 6 months later, I proposed, not at a fancy resort, not during an expensive vacation, but at the same restaurant where we first met, the same table, the same window, the same place where her worst date had unexpectedly become the best day of her life. When I knelt down, she started crying before I even finished speaking. The entire restaurant applauded when she said yes. Even the staff remembered us. It felt like a miracle. But the most powerful part of this story happened years later. Grace continued teaching. One of her students was a quiet little girl named Hannah. The child came from a difficult home and struggled with confidence. Many teachers had given up on reaching her. Grace didn't. She invested time, patience, and love. Years passed. One day, long after Hannah graduated, a letter arrived in our mailbox. Inside was a note. Hannah wrote that she had become a pediatric nurse. She explained that there had been a period during childhood when she felt invisible and unwanted. She had considered giving up on her dreams. Then she met a teacher who believed in her, a teacher who showed her kindness when she needed it most. That teacher was Grace. The letter ended with words neither of us will ever forget. It said that one person's kindness had changed the entire direction of her life. As Grace read those words, tears filled her eyes. And suddenly, I understood something profound. The man who rejected her on that blind date thought he was walking away from someone insignificant. He couldn't have been more wrong, because the value of a person isn't measured by status, income, appearance, or accomplishments. It's measured by the lives they touch. And Grace had changed countless lives, including mine. If this story has touched your heart so far, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need a reminder that kindness can change everything. And before we reach the ending, I have a special request. Please comment the words, "Kindness always matters," if you believe one small act of compassion can completely change someone's future. Today, Grace and I have been married for 12 years. We have 2 children. We still visit that restaurant every anniversary. And every time we sit by that same window, I think about how differently life could have turned out if I had looked away, if I had minded my own business, if I had ignored someone else's pain. One simple question changed everything. Not because it was clever, not because it was romantic, but because it came from kindness. Sometimes people enter our lives through extraordinary circumstances. Sometimes they arrive through ordinary moments, a smile, a conversation, a helping hand, or a simple question. The world is full of people carrying invisible pain, people wondering if they matter, people sitting alone, convinced no one sees them. And sometimes all it takes to change a life is choosing to walk over instead of walking away. Because the greatest stories often begin when someone decides to be kind. And sometimes, the person you're helping ends up becoming the greatest blessing of your own life. That night, a woman was rejected on a blind date. But what she didn't know was that God was quietly redirecting her path. And what looked like rejection was actually the beginning of something beautiful. The beginning of a love story neither of us could have imagined. And it all started with four simple words. Can I sit here?